So I think it's for pretty obvious reasons that we have strong inclinations to be understood by other people. There is a problem here, though, because to the degree that we wish to be perceptible to other people, we are essentially conditioning our own expressions on the arbitrary and contingent social and political variables characterizing other people's attitudes and perceptions. Now, in an ideal community, this might not be a problem. If technological or other contextual variables veer off in a certain way that will tend to bias and malform popular perceptions, then thinking and speaking to be perceptible can easily lock one into a whole life of inescapable confusion, suffering, and just reproducing of precisely everything one despises about the world at large. So this, in a nutshell, is the problem of perceptibility. Now, note that perception refers to sense data, essentially. Perceptibility has a kind of pre-conscious connotation. You might think of perception as kind of like quote-unquote understanding, but the latter concept is misleading in some sense because it connotes a kind of conscious intellection. What's worth clarifying is that the problem here is not the prospect of being correctly understood intellectually. We will and should seek to be understood intellectually, but only by those who can understand. Here we are invoking a kind of connotation to understanding that is different than that of intellection. It's more intuitive. Understanding is a different mode of comprehension, if you will. Seeking to be perceptible means catering to the initial and cheapest pieces of others' psychological and behavioral equipment. To be perceptible means that institutions and their human trustees essentially know how to manipulate you. Being perceptible means you're easily pigeonholed. And what's worse is that often you are correctly pigeonholed if you're trying to be perceivable. If you want to optimize for how you are perceived, and especially if you build a whole life on how you are perceived, for instance, anyone whose income is based on a kind of all-consuming status game in a big institutionalized hierarchy, then most of your thoughts, words, and actions on a daily basis are easily controlled, and in fact are controlled by pretty much anyone above you in the institutional hierarchy. For, by definition, those people and their edicts have a greater influence on the perceptions of everyone else who is attuned to that hierarchy than anything you might be able to say or do. And thus pleasing one's status superiors becomes a necessity for those who wish to be perceived well. Now, this matter is greatly complicated. I should say that in context of institutional breakdown and fragmentation, it's a whole different story, right? As we're currently observing, I think, in the contemporary political status quo, so we will need to add some refinements to this model, if you will, but we can do that later. And for now, I think it suffices to say that most of us are still maneuvering lives that are overwhelmingly characterized by the inertia of mass institutions. So even if institutions do break down rapidly over the course of the next few generations or whenever, really, the general lessons here are going to suffice and still be quite useful for most people most of the time, for at least some time ahead. In the next video, I talk about the problem of perceivability as a problem of motivational hijacking.